I have been so moved and so shaped by your work. Probably not something that is the first time that you're hearing that, but you introduced mystery back into my life and said that mystery was a good thing.
Absolutely.
And a human thing. When did you realise that mystery was a good thing and an important thing?
That's a very good question, and there's a lot of different ways of answering it. I think somebody once said that, in fact, Coleridge said that a poet is a person who brings the vision of the child into the powers of the adult. They don't lose that. So I think it's natural to us to find the world marvellous and strange and mysterious, and I think children do genuinely... I think this is why Jesus said you've got to become like a child to inherit the kingdom of God. I think they naturally see a beauty and a resonance and a kind of mysteriousness and wildness to things that we, as we grow up and as well, our minds are sort of trained in schools and we do analytic reason, we kind of suppress it. So one answer to that is, yes, I as a child, I always felt there was something beautiful shimmering through everything else. I always think, in a sense for me, every wood was an enchanted wood. That was partly because I read the Narnia books and I read the, great fairy stories and I grew up with that. When I was an adult, I read an essay by C.S. Lewis called On 3 Ways of Writing for Children. And he said in that essay that he wanted to write about enchanted woods and children in enchanted woods, not so kids could always just escape and get away to a book from dull reality, but to lift the veil off dull reality, right. That after reading one of his stories, a child might find every wood a little more enchanted. Well, in a sense, I was that child. So that's and there's an answer to all of that before I was even a writer, but I remember somebody saying something to me about a mystery that really went to my heart when I hadn't come back to my Christian faith yet. I rejected it and tried to have a completely rational, materialistic account of everything. But something transcendent kept shimmering through that my atheism couldn't account for. But when I was still on that journey, I listened to this Franciscan friar preaching, and then I had a conversation with him afterwards, and he was talking about the mysteries. That is to say, that the Greek word mysterion was the word that was translated sacrament into Latin, and he was saying that at the heart, for example, in his case, of Christian worship, there was something. So I said, well, what is this mystery? Tell me more, because my imagination was kindled. And he said something brilliant. He said, a mystery is something about which the last word can never be said. And then he knew me, I tend to go on a bit, as you'll probably discover. So he says, a mystery is something about which the last word can never be said. And then he looked me right there and said, that's not a challenge, Malcolm. But I was really fascinated by that there was something that you could never fully define, you could never exhaust it. No matter how many times you came to it and tried to say something about it, you would never have it taped. You would never get your mind right around it. Later on, I came to learn from Shakespeare these two different words for how we know things, or the mode of our knowing, which are apprehend and comprehend. And in a famous speech in A Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare has the line that imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. And then he goes on to say, if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. And I began to realise there was a sort of spectrum in everything between apprehend. Some things you think you've completely comprehended, and then suddenly they open up. And you have little apprehensions, you can't quite put your finger on it. And then you read a poem that seems to get it. So the idea that there was this fountain of beautiful being flowing into things, and that your little snapshot of the tree you thought you saw last week, or the sunset that you saw, you haven't got it. You haven't got it taped. There's always more. There's a kind of over brimmingness and over plusness. When I came to study theology and things more, and I had the great joy of learning New Testament Greek, which is, it's a fantastic language. Greek is a fantastic language. And they've just got some great words. And there's a word in Greek called which is Pleroma. And it's sometimes translated fullness, Like there's a famous line in one of Paul's letters about Jesus, says, in him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. But fullness is like a really bad translation of pleroma, because fullness means like full, that's it, you've had your lot, I'm giving you this up to the pint.
Yeah.
And that's the level you've got. Whereas pleroma means, to borrow another phrase, Jesus says, packed down, brimming, overflowing. There's always more. There's something which no words or structure or doctrinal statement or definition can contain it. It's always overflowing beyond it, and that's what I mean by mystery.
The reason that I guess that mystery had an impact on me so deeply, and the reason that the question feels so important to me, and the exploration of how we engage with mystery feels so vital, is because I really feel like one of the symptoms of the world that we live in today is that we really don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
We don't know how to handle mystery. And hence, I guess imagination, in a way, is the muscle, the organ that we use to engage with mystery.
Yeah, it is, absolutely.
So I wonder if you could speak to a little bit. So the premise that I'm working on in my book is this idea that if we've got an imagination muscle, it has the ability to help us navigate mystery. And that can either be the creation of the beautiful future, but often I feel like it is involved in the creation of the fear of the future.
Yeah.
How do you see the imagination being an active part of future building, and with the recognition that if it's not working properly, I don't know how the right language for that.
I think there's a great line. My way of answering a question or thinking about it is a line of poetry, usually my own or someone else's, comes to my mind, and it helps because I think poetry is a way of knowing. So you're putting your finger on the imagination as having both this enormous and beautiful potential in which you can imagine a future and then bring it into being, and that's powerful. But also the imagination can cripple you. You can be so full of apprehensions and imaginations of how badly things could go that you can be paralyzed. Now, there's a line of Shakespeare's in one of his sonnets, I think he says, lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. Now, what that is saying is the more good and true and beautiful a thing is, the more terrible it is if it goes wrong.
Right.
That's why so-called religious, hatred or bigotry is particularly powerful and destructive, because religious insight is one of the greatest things that can happen to any person. A connection. So if that gets abused, if that gets misdirected, you have a problem. Now, I'm a Christian, so I have that worldview. That doesn't mean I think I've got everything taped, because I believe in mystery. So I'm not, I'm the last person to say, I've just ticked this box.
Is the way
I get it. I understand. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying I've heard this story. I find the grand narrative, as they say, a story so beautiful and attractive that I'm drawn to it. And I'm willing to live my life as if, that makes sense, because it does seem to make sense, and I'm willing to trust it. Now, in that worldview that I have, there's a big pattern which, to use abstract language, I don't really like to use it, which you would call creation, fall, redemption. Basically, the kind of that story is that God makes everything just true and good and beautiful. But that we kind of deliberately screw it up. We take a good thing and we misuse it. And part of the Christian story is the idea is that we've all inherited that. Do you know what I mean? There's a really weird saying in the Old Testament which a lot of people find offensive, but it's kind of an insight, and it goes, "The parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge." Like we bear the burden of other people's screwing up.
Yeah.
And in the way that's told poetically or mythically, if you like, in Christianity, is that there's an original Adam and Eve, and they've got it all together, and it's really good, and they screw up. But of course, the story doesn't end there, because the Christian story is that God says, "Okay, I can handle this." He doesn't stop us from screwing up, but he says, "I'll come into the middle of that screwed upness, and I'll help you to put it right again. I'll do it from the inside. I'm not like some puppet master pulling the strings and making you do stuff. I'm going to get involved in your story." So now, I think every human faculty is involved in beautiful, good beginnings, a fall, and the possibility of being set right again. And that, therefore, includes the imagination.
Right.
That just as it has this capacity for us to get an insight into mystery, and I mean, if you want a beautiful, I mean, most of us, just like we've got two eyes, you know, and two ears, right, two arms. Often we seem to be given complementary things, you know, left hand, right hand. The brain is like that, you know, and we know quite a lot about left brain, right brain. So one of the ways I think we have two great ways of getting to know the world, which I think are equally important and complementary. One, like two eyes. One of them is reason and rationality and logic and science and all that stuff. I would never diss that. But the other is imagination, the power to make a story, the power to imagine something that's not there yet. Because, of course, the imagination has the word image. And in imagination, we take kind of what we know and we reshape it in a new and beautiful way.
Yeah.
Now, I think both of those are fallen as well. But part of the fall is we've screwed up the relationship between them. So I think we've totally overemphasized reason in the scientific West for the last 300 years. It's like we've been squinting at the world through one eye.
Yeah.
I mean, what somebody once said, every system of thought is a squint at the truth. And the more rigid the system, the worse the squint. So most of my work is about recovering the imagination as a complementary way of knowing.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis summed it up brilliantly by saying, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning.
Yeah.
That's how you put it all. Now, nevertheless, just to the extent that we have the capacity to do beautiful things, then we have the capacity. And we have to, but the main thing is to notice when that's happening. When our imagination is becoming, in some sense, fallen or shadowed or perverted or degraded, there's a kind of monitor in us somewhere that goes off as a little alarm that goes, you know, this isn't right. Mm. Now, the way to do that is not to suppress your imagination or stop imagining stuff, but to make sure that it imagines the good as well as the evil. That it comes, do you see what I mean? That it brings those things together. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, if you think about Milton's great poem, Paradise Lost, he has to imagine hell. Like, after the initial opening sort of prologue, he basically he imagines the devils in hell, and he imagines their response to their fall, and he imagines them speaking about what their demonic principles are. And he gets it down to a single sentence in Satan, where Satan says in Book 1 of Paradise Lost, he says, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. That's the hellish mindset. It's got to be about me. I'm the center of it, and I'm going to do you see what I mean? I mean, if you believe it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, then you will reign in hell and you'll never have heaven. You know that heaven is about service. But you could, even in the worst situation, you could imagine differently. You could imagine that you were loved by God, and that you could begin to behave as if. Yeah. It's like there's a fantastic bit in the Silver Chair, the Narnia story, where they're stuck down in this dark cave of the witch, and she's kind of hypnotizing them with this thrumming music, and it's all. And then she says, like, there's no Narnia, you've just made it up, it's not there, you know, forget about it. And then Puddleglum, the marsh wiggle, who's a real pessimist, says, well, I don't care. I'm going to live like a Narnia, and even if there's no Narnia, he can still imagine. So he said, maybe we've made it all up. Maybe, you know, your lamp is the only light and we only made up the sun. Maybe your cat is the only thing and we only made up our sun. But if that's true, how can 3 kids and a marsh wiggle make up a better world than the one you've got it? There must be something. It must come from somewhere. So the same imagination that might sometimes beset us with fears is the imagination which can deal with those fears. I mean, somebody once said that, you know, you shouldn't read fairy stories to kids because they shouldn't know about giants and bogies and monsters, and, you know, you should protect them from that. And G.K. Chesterton wrote a fantastic defense. He said, no. even if you never read a kid a fairy story, they know about giants and bogies and monsters. They have nightmares and they imagine the thing under the bed. Anyway, they've always known about wicked giants because they have to live with adults and wicked giants. But what they do need to know, they already know about giants. They need to know about Jack the Giant Killer.
Yeah.
They already know about dragons. They need to know about St. George. They need a story in which a little person with very few things who's quite frightened nevertheless goes in and turns things around.
Yeah.
And that's the story that gives them... So the way out of bad imagination is not less imagination. It's more imagination. It's good imagination. And the person who really thought about that, as you'll be unsurprised to hear, is C.S. Lewis. And he thought about it in relation to somebody who might be regarded as the kind of great-granddaddy of all beautiful, imaginative fairy tales, particularly in our age, and that's George MacDonald, who was a Victorian writer. And Lewis says that when he was still an atheist and full of the problems of the world, and he randomly picked up this book for adults, for young adults, by George MacDonald called Fantastes. And he says his imagination was baptized. I mean, there's real horrors in that book and difficulties, and there's a wicked ash tree that's out to get you and stuff. But there's also incredible beauty and truth and goodness. And when Lewis said my imagination was baptized, he went back to that image several times. And he said, well, baptism isn't just about blessing something and saying, now it's okay.
Yeah.
Baptism is about death and resurrection. When you originally in baptism, you would have gone under the water. It's like a kind of ritual drowning. When you come up out of it, it's like a ritual resurrection, almost like a new birth. I mean, somebody once said the font is the womb of the church. So he felt he had to let his imagination go, let all the dark parts of it, as it were, go back and die, and then have his imagination reborn. And he believed that the source... If you take the view, obviously not everybody takes this view, but if you take the view, as I do, that the world is made, it means something. I don't think of the world as being like a piece of clockwork. I don't think of it as some kind of like some watchmaking god made it up and wound it up and now it's all just winding down and it's a mechanical thing. I don't think that's an adequate picture of the world. I think we got stupid. We made clocks and we thought, wow, I've got a thing that goes by itself. Maybe the world's like that. We kind of just, it's like we make computers and we say, oh, maybe I've got hardware and software. It's a really stupid thing to do. If we compare the mystery of our minds or gods with something we've made, we're always comparing the greater with the lesser. Because if we made it, it's less than we are.
Yeah.
And we dumb ourselves down into copies of the machines we make, right? But my view of the world isn't that it's a piece of clockwork. My view of the world is much more like a poem that's being spoken. I mean, I could write a poem down for you, right? I could give you the poem on a piece of paper. And if I didn't tell you it was a poem, you said, oh, I'm going to study this. And you could look at the chemical composition of the paper and you could do a statistical study of the repetition of the weird shapes of the letters and you could do you could work for 2 years and produce a stack of totally true scientific accounts of the piece of paper with the poem on it and never know that it was a poem. But then if one day I said, hey, it's a poem, read it. You go, oh my goodness, it means something. Like all this stuff that I analysed actually means something. And it means something because there's a mind behind it that's speaking to me.
Yeah.
Right? So I think the world is like that. I think we're being spoken into being right now. I think it's kind of utterance. And I think we've wasted time for the last 200 years doing a chemical analysis of the paper the poem's written on and forgotten to read it.
Yeah.
But Lewis says imagination is the organ of meaning. So to read it, we need our imaginations. We need to realise that God is speaking to us all the time through symbols. And the practice, like the gym where we can do that, is like reading literature and poetry because there I speak to you in a symbol. If William Burns, if Robert Burns says, I mean, it's a cliche now, but it was a great first line back in the day. He had a song, my love is like a red, red rose that sweetly blooms in June, right? My love is like a violin that's sweetly played in tune. So, oh, that's interesting. Like, why would love be like a rose? And then I can go and look at a real rose.
Yeah.
And I suddenly realised it's telling me about the way it's been in a bud, the way it unfolds, the way it's precious, the way it seems to speak of something that lasts forever, and yet do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm finding out a whole bunch of stuff about an invisible thing, which we'll call love, by somebody having taken a visible thing and saying that's a bit what it's like. Now, I don't think we're the only people who do that. I think God makes all the visible things, including you and me, because he's saying something to us through them. And that's what we need our imagination to pay attention to. But yes, we also have a shadow of our imagination, and we have our nightmares. But the nightmares are not the last word. I actually think that the reason why God made a world in which we have night and day and winter and spring was that he was meaning something by it. He's really saying to you, however dark your night is right now, day is coming. You know, day is coming. Every morning is God's poem of resurrection.
It's another victory over the night.
Do you see what I mean? So when you're in a nightmare in the middle of the night and you're paralyzed by fear of the future, or you've got kind of climate crisis or whatever, you have to go, if I can imagine this dark future, I can equally imagine a bright one. And I know that this is the night and the dawn is coming, you know. And heaviness may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Or again, those that sow in tears shall reap with songs of joy. That's another metaphor that God's put into the world, that you don't get the growth till you let go of the seed.
Yeah. So what I find really fascinating, and it's something that I'm actively exploring through the process of writing, is that if we call it art, when I say art, I mean the biggest possible definition of art, including poetry, music, a kind word to a person.
Oh yeah, that's art.
You know,
the art of living.
The broadest possible definition. It seems to me that art is the way that we wrestle out that the warring factions of our imagination.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
What would be your encouragement, in a sense? Because one of the biggest questions I get asked all the time is, it's easy for someone who's a filmmaker or someone that works doing design and photography to integrate the imagination and art into their life, and art can become a very powerful weapon in my own pursuit of wrestling between my night and day. How does that cascade out, if you like, into people that maybe would say, I've got nothing to do with art? I mean, me and you would be of the opinion that that's a false understanding. So I another idea that I draw out of the faith that I have is simply this idea that we're kind of made in the image of God, that there's something, you know, if you like God like that. And I think, because obviously if there is a God, he's creative. And if we're made in his image, then that would be where our creativity comes from. Now, I don't think that's specially the creativity of people who happen to be able to have the privilege, as you might have or I have. Actually, that's your life, that's your living. I'm a writer, that's what I do. I mean, I can't thank God enough that I have that privilege. But I don't think that makes me any more special than anybody else. In fact, in my particular art, my art would be dead in the water if it weren't for the imagination of my readers, all my readers. You know, if I give you a poem of mine, right, you got a lot of squiggles on a piece of paper. And if, you know, if the poem talks about, you know, another autumn now unfolds in hidden glints of red and gold, right? You're the one that sees the autumn and the hidden glints and sees the tree. All I gave you was the starter kit, right? So I would want to say to anybody who says, "Oh, well, I like art, but I'm not artistic," or "I love music, but I'm not a musician," or "I like poetry, but I'm not a poet." You are as good a poet as the best poem you've ever read by Shakespeare or Shelley or anybody else, because they imagined something and they translated it into squiggles. You know, to words, and tried to make the words as beautiful as possible. But your imagination is the one that's created the poem or the fairy story, or do you know what I mean, as you see it. And that's incredible. I mean, that's, I have to say, the one art form where, if you like, the artist is doing a bit more work and you're
being given a bit more of a starter kit and have to do less work is film.
Yeah,
Film is a
yeah.
great art form, but somebody's literally doing the
Doing
imaging.
so much
for
heavy lifting.
But it's still only a sequence of images. You've got to find the meaning in it.
Yeah.
Your imagination is still involved. So I would say that everybody, whatever your life is, if you respond to and enjoy a piece of art by anybody, you're already creative. And the other thing, of course, is we are all artists in the medium of life itself.
For sure.
You make... I mean, I talk about making the poem of my being. That I'm trying to work on my life in the same way that I work on a sonnet. I want it to have a good ending. I want it to be full of meaning. I want it to be beautiful. I want it to be shaped. I want it to keep the rules that I've given it. So it can be, I don't want it to be a splurgy mess, you know. I use form because I think form gives beauty and longevity to things, you know. And I feel exactly the same way about my life as I would about any work of art. And I've met some really great, brilliant, generous, beautiful artists in life that nobody's ever heard of and that have never put a pen to paper and will never be remembered by this world as great artists. But in fact, they are great artists. And, you know, God and his angels are applauding with every step and going, nice one, see what you did there, you know. So, you know, I never... It's a sad and oppressive delusion if we think we're not artistic.
Yeah.
We all are.
Because I think that's really... Artistic, again, in that broader definition, is our way of engaging with building whatever comes next.
Yeah.
And a lack of it is our passivity in the future, if you like.
I think, you know, there's... if you think, again, I mean, I'm drawing on the Christian teaching, but Jesus is a famous Sermon on the Mount, right? And he gives you a whole sort of way of looking at the world and way of seeing things. And he says things that are apparently completely, flatly contradicted by life. Like, you know, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Well, you know, it's precisely the meek who don't inherit the earth because the pushy push them aside, you know. And, you know, blessed are the peacemakers, they shall be called the children of God, you know. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. And I think what he's saying is imagine it. Imagine the kingdom. Live as if you can bring the kingdom into being by living like this. You know, I wrote a poem. I could get it off the shelf here. I wrote a poem about called As If, which was about as if is something that the imagination loves to say. What if this? What if this? You know, what if I did this? What if I lived as if this was the case? And it was about the invitation I felt to imagine a better thing. And of course, the most famous teaching of Jesus about the kingdom is what's called the parables of the kingdom. And they're all stories that appeal to your imagination. Look, this little grain of mustard seed, you think it's totally insignificant. It's going to become a tree that shelters all the birds, you know.
Yeah.
There it is, you know. Think of who you are as that little seed. Blossom where you're planted, grow, put out branches, you know. I can do that because he's appealed to my imagination and because I can imagine it.
Yeah. Do you see, or how do you perceive this idea that obviously we're on the same page with this, that the imagination is given more room when we're children.
Yeah.
And then it kind of slowly dies away. That seems to be the general understanding, if you like, or seems to be a kind of prevailing thought, is that it belongs to childhood.
Yeah.
And we kind of put it away in the toy box in the loft, along with all our other toys. What is the answer to that problem? How do we ensure that as adults, particularly if we thought we had put it in the loft 10 years ago? I mean, obviously there's examples of imagination that people use in the everyday, which is one thing, but that kind of more vibrant sense of the imagination. Yeah. How do we get that back out the loft?
Well, it's a very good question again. I think one of the ways we do that is we have to try and remember and stay in touch with and almost speak to our inner child. the really imaginative child that did all that stuff with crayons and, is in here. And he may be locked away in some lonely room in our mind crying because nobody wants to play with him, And you, as an adult, can find that little kid that was in you and learn from them. And in fact, I think one of the most beautiful things in if you like, the biological patterning of life is that just at the point where we've almost completely lost in touch with our inner kid, if all goes well, we have kids ourselves. And one of the reasons, then we get to watch a little kid grow up and they invite us into our play. One of the best things you can do is not just good for your kids, but is a liberation for you, is play with your kids and enter into their imaginative games and make believe and pretend with them. And that actually opens you up. And that's why I think, because we've got such a utilitarian material thing and everybody's got to have a job, and now both parents have got to have a job, and we've sort of outsourced and professionalized childcare.
Yeah.
And that may be a lot. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong to have a babysitter or a child in a nursery, but we've got to make sure that we don't outsource the deepest relations and playfulness with kids. And I think, we could easily, we're actually not a very poor nation compared with the other nations of the earth. And the more machinery and the more technology we have that is quote-unquote labour-saving devices, why is it that we're all labouring so much harder and not even seeing each other or having time for our families? I think we could and should organise our society. Let us imagine a society for a minute in which that business of nurturing children and in your turn being retaught by them about how to have a childlike imagination was regarded as one of the main purposes of life. That not a side thing that's causing a problem because you're less efficient at work because you spent some time with your kids, but you do your work efficiently so you can spend time with your kids. Do you see the difference?
Yeah.
And I don't think it's impossible to imagine such a world, and I think there are some societies that do it much better than we do. And we've made some steps in the right direction. We have statutory paternity leave now as well as maternity leave. But we can do way better than that.
I think it's really interesting how, and this is one of the pursuits of what I'm writing, is where these practical spaces where we can pull on to say this is a way of liberating imagination among us, because obviously it's imagination that in theory drives us to a better place, to use Christian language again, to a place that looked more like heaven. And it's really interesting that you pull on that thread and say, well, actually, you know what, if we create more time for family, particularly relationships between the younger and the older generations, that could be a key way of liberating imagination generally. I mean, stuff like play. I mean, I think we've got the whole thing. I mean, we now, even the church, God help us, has kind of segregated worship. So there's the kids thing going on over there, and we get the kids out of the way. And then we've got the young adults group, and then we've got the doddery old pensioners group, to which I now belong or whatever. And a kid can't be a really good kid unless they also get to be with doddery old pensioners, and doddery old pensioners, well, what's the point of living if you can't be with kids, We need to stop doing that. We need to stop, niching everybody in these little enclaves. Yeah.
But of course, it's messy and awkward when we're all together.
Absolutely.
But that's how it is,
So to take a different direction, in the process of writing my book, one of the greatest joys of my life and the greatest pains in my life as well is deciding that at the start of every chapter I was going to write a fairy tale.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
I cannot say with precise articulation as to why that felt like the right thing to do, because I think I've just had glimmers and random moments across my life which have led me to a point where that makes sense. I wonder whether you could put some of your fine articulation as to why fairy tales are an incredible way in which we come to understand deep and meaningful things.
Well, that's a very big question, really. The person who's thought about this most deeply, or two people, are George MacDonald and J.R.R. Tolkien, I think. And I would recommend, you may have already read J.R.R. Tolkien's essay on fairy stories.
I'm familiar, yeah.
You know, and he talks about how those stories offer us, they offer us certain things we want, consolation and escape. But they also offer us hope. And he invents this wonderful word, eucatastrophe, the good catastrophe, that in a story there's some kind of catastrophe, but then there's a turn that brings joy. There's a turn that brings hope in a lot of fairy stories. And it's real hope precisely because the fairy stories were also about the dark things and the difficult things. And some fairy stories that you make up, this is not allegory. It's not like I've got a set of statements I want you to believe and then I make up some exact equivalent. I write the story, but then the story. So G.K. Chesterton says that one of the books that changed his life, which he maintains is one of the most completely realistic books he's ever read, is a children's fairy story by George MacDonald called The Princess and the Goblin. And basically he says all you need to know is that she lives in a house like we do. It's in a house with doors and stairs and cupboards and there's a basement, a cellar. And the point about this house in the story is that it's constantly being undermined by these evil goblins that are going to come up, not from the outside, but inside, up through the cellar of the house. So that's the danger. But the stories of the princess who's born in the house, but she finds that there are stairs that go right up to the top bit of the house that she's never visited, and sometimes she can't get up there. The stairs seem to change and move. But somewhere up there is this beautiful great-great-grandmother who is lucid and full of light and has a fire that's made out of roses. And Chesterton says, I get it. I am that house. I am the princess, if you like. I'm always being undermined from within, but I'm always trying to find this other light, this person, this beautiful grace that's also in the same house. Now, I don't think George MacDonald was thinking, I want to write an allegory for how Chesterton is going to feel. I mean, do you know what I mean? He was just right. I'll tell you one other thing about that story. When the little princess finds the wonderful, beautiful great-grandmother who's very ancient, but also beautiful and young at the same time, because the story, you can be that. And, of course, that's true about people as well. There are people who are outwardly old and inwardly incredibly young and so on. And, she has a fire which is made out of roses, and she can take one of the roses, and when the princess's dress is all muddy and she's fallen and, she can be cleansed. But the great thing is she has to go off on an adventure find someone who's going to help deal with the goblins where they are. And the great-grandmother opens a drawer in her room and she has this wound thing. She's always spinning, this grandmother. So she's got a skein of thread. And she puts the skein, the end of it, safely in this drawer in her upper chamber. And she gives Irene, the princess, the other end of it's an invisible thread, and says, can you feel it between your fingers? It's always attached here. So wherever you go, when you need to get back to me, you just follow this thread. And sometimes the thread seems to lead her away from the house or down rather than up, but she knows that the end of the thread is with this lady who loves her. Now, that is true on so many levels. In a way, I mean, I can talk about it being true of my faith. I can talk about it being true of my relationship with my wife, that there's when I'm trying to follow through the thread of an idea. Now, a fairy story was able to tell all that, and it will carry on telling all that and generating. It's not an allegory, but it is, in C.S. Lewis's phrase, it's suggestive of incipient allegory, this kind of meanings. And again, a deeply told story has the power to clarify things that the author of the story may never have thought about. So, when The Lord of the Rings was published in the early 50s, it was obviously after the bomb had dropped on Hiroshima, and we had these terrible weapons that we shouldn't use because they would destroy us all. And everybody was going like, oh, he's written an allegory, the ring is like nuclear weapons, and we've got to, we have to let it go. It's a kind of proto-nuclear disarmament parable. Well, he had the basic plot of that complete before there was ever an atom bomb. Because he was dealing in that story with an eternal truth that we always have, and it's constantly going to be showing you things that you need to know. You know, so that's the power of story, and that's the gift of imagination. I find that with my poems as well. Like, obviously, I have to have some idea of what the poem's going to be about before I write it, right?
Yeah.
But if I write the poem and it is only about, it only has what I thought it was going to be about in it by the time I finished it, then it's not a poem. It's a note to self. It's a memory.
Yeah.
It's not a poem. It's only when the poem has more in it, or it has things in it I wasn't expecting,
because it's really
a poem. And I'm sure you find that when you make up your stories.
Because I had this. I mean, I've written a whole number, and there's an incredible amount in my archive now of things that stepped into allegory, and that they've, to me, they became business analogies, if that makes sense. So I wanted to write something about self-awareness, because I thought, what's one of the keys to becoming a friend of the imagination, so to speak? And I was like, well, self-awareness has got to be one of the big ones. And I ended up writing this allegory about a bear who gets a beehive stuck on his head.
Yeah.
But it really quickly stepped out of fairy tale into, I'm just trying to make a point and giving it some
if it's
nice
just
images.
a point, there's no point. I mean,
I can't really explain how. Do you think it's inherently to do with that discovery piece in and of itself for you?
Discover
is that how you separate and distinct out the process of writing allegory?
You discover more and more through the story you've written. And having written the story then turns around and teaches you things that you didn't know you knew, or you know. And that's why it's a good story. And I mean, obviously there are little allegories, and I mean, to some degree, Aesop's fables, certainly the way they are.
For sure.
This is one point. But great story, great myth doesn't do that.
Yeah.
The story is wiser than we are.
Yeah, it just takes you deeper and deeper.
But I take the view that, I mean, the only thing that gives me, if you like, the temerity to call myself a poet in the first place, is that I know that all the words I use are older and wiser than I am. I kind of think my job is to listen for what the poem has to teach me. I get a lot of letters now from people who are saying, I keep your poems by my bedside, they've been really helpful and they've helped me. And then they want to write to me personally for some advice for some crisis in their life. And I have to write back and say, actually,
that is
the poems know more than I do. You'd be really quite disappointed, to meet me. I wrote the poems because I need to know what's in them, not because I already know what's in them. And Yeats, the great poet Yeats, when he was he got to that stage in life where you have Oxford wants to publish his collected poems, right? Which in one way is a great accolade, but in another way it's like a funeral bell. It's like saying, well, it's okay, there's the rocking chair, you've done your best, we're going to collect it now. But anyway, he had to write a preface to his own poetry, right? So he writes this thing, and he says, who is the poet? Capital P. The poet who speaks to you in the first person says, that says to you, tread softly for you tread on my dreams, or, I have desired to go where springs not fail. The person speaking to you, who is that? And he says, the poet, capital P, is not the bundle of incoherence that sits down to breakfast. I'm a bundle of incoherence sitting down to breakfast, but I can make poems. The poem is a made thing. And it's exactly like the idea of you bringing order out of chaos. But, I mean, somebody said of the poet Tennyson that he was always carrying about within him a dark piece of chaos, which he was always manufacturing into cosmos. And so I'm offering cosmos in my poems. But I still remain a chaotic person, which is why I write the poetry, because I want a bit of order and cosmos, which is why I have to say to people, you've already had not only the best in me, you've had better than the best in me, because that's why I wrote it, to find that better.
Yeah. I will land on this, because I think perhaps the thing that strikes me that's most wonderful about your offering is your use of words. And bringing words to things which people find it hard to find words for.
Yeah.
What have you found has been the place of words in your life, and what's the hope for the words that you will discover in the future?
Well, I mean, I think every artist, whatever their form of art, loves their medium, right? Painters love paint, and sculptors like bronze and stone, and musicians love their instruments, you know. And obviously my medium and my instrument is language as a poet. So I love words. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon, we got this kind of rather abstract Latinate word called vocabulary, right? Which is actually not a particularly useful word. The Anglo-Saxons, from whom we stem, what they called the vocabulary, they called it the word-hoard. The word-hoard. And it was like, you're like a dragon on a hoard, you know, you've got all this, so it's a treasury. So the Irish poet Seamus Heaney, in a poem called North, which is about kind of his own how to write poetry, he says, lie down in the word-hoard, burrow the coil and gleam of your furrowed brain, trust to the feel of what nubbed treasures your hands have known. You know, I think one of the things I do as a poet is I try to make music with words. I try to listen for them, listen for their sound, you know. I mean, I wrote a poem called Hospitality about my awful phrase, writing process. I probably can't remember, but it begins, I turn a certain key within its wards, unlock my doors, and set them open wide to entertain a company of words. While some come early and with eager stride, others must be enticed and coaxed a little, the shy and rare, unused to company, who'll need some time to feel at home and settle. I bid them welcome all. I make them free of all that's mine, and they are good to me. I set each word in the order they like best and listen for their wisdom. And they are good to me. And though we know each word is my free guest, they sometimes leave a poem in return. You know, and that's kind of how I feel about words.
That's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Giving us some time.
Yeah, that's cool.
And from the bottom of my heart, and for everyone that's listening to this, I want you to know that this man has inspired more in me than he will ever know. And so much of what I'm doing now is, I guess, I hope is somewhat a legacy.
Yeah, well,
it's
good to know. I think also art should be generous, but it should be generative.
Yeah.
Art begets art. So it's very encouraging to me, Matt, I have to say, you know, as I am sort of, you know, old and grey and full of sleep, as Yeats would say, that, you know, people of your generation are actually picking up on what I'm doing and making something with it. You know, that's what it's there for. So it's always encouraging to me, you know, to find that I have young readers who find what I'm doing helpful. What
can people, if they want to engage with you in the future, what books do you think they should buy? Where can they find you? Where can they hear you speak?
Well, I think the poetry is the heart of what I have to offer. If people are just looking for like a general collection of my poems about all kinds of stuff, obviously I'm also a Christian, I'm a priest.
Yeah.
I've got a book called The Singing Bowl, which has poems on all kinds of different subjects. That's probably a good place to start. If somebody's specifically within a Christian frame and wants something to deepen that faith, then my other book of poems, The Sounding the Seasons, might be a one to go for. But I have written also, if you like, academically about the imagination. I've got a book called Lifting the Veil, which is Imagination and the Kingdom of God. And that's a kind of defense of the imagination as a truth.
Which, for everyone listening, is something I lean on and use a lot in my writing.
That is specifically addressed to artists and creative people to give them a bit of a sort of philosophical and theological underpinning and encouragement for what they're doing. So, you know, you're onto something. You're not just making stuff up in the dark. This is actually important. So yeah, that's quite a slim volume, you know, and it's quite readable, I think. So I would go for that. Obviously, I think poetry is at its best when it's spoken out loud. I think it has to be breathed into being. So I do go around and do poetry. But I have a YouTube channel where it's kind of like a sort of point of view. You just knock on the door and I said, come in, and I pick up books and read you a poem, maybe mine, maybe somebody else's, or talk about a thing for about 10 minutes, like 10 to 15 minutes. I started it in lockdown when my students couldn't come in and see me, and I wanted them to have that experience still. I was missing them as well, you know. So I did. My wife kindly holds the iPhone, you know, and knocks on the door, and we do this thing. So that's a lot of people find that helpful and consoling, and you know, so there's that as well.
Brilliant. Well, I hope that this is the first of many occasions where I cross your path, and thank you so much.
My pleasure.